Hello and welcome to BYJU'S. In the last week of May, Prime Minister Modi carried out a very important visit to three Southeast Asian countries, which included Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore. During this visit, a number of important developments in the field of defense, economic relations and cultural ties were taken up, and this is considered as a very big development as far as India's Act East policy is concerned. So in this session, we shall discuss about the major developments that took place during the visit, and we will also analyze the impact of this visit on India's policies with regard to the Southeast Asian region, and also the emerging concept of a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. The Prime Minister began his visit with Indonesia, and during the discussions, both the leaders have prioritized defense and economic ties between the two countries. In the defense domain, India and Indonesia have given a lot of focus on maritime cooperation. Both countries have tried to build closer relations in the field of maritime security and maritime cooperation. And in the run-up to this visit, Indonesia has granted India access to one of its important naval port facilities called the Sabang Port. The Sabang Port is strategically located at the northern tip of the Sumatran island. This is the Sumatran island. At the northern tip of Sumatra, you have the Sabang Port, which is just a few hundred nautical miles away from India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Also, the Sabang Port is located right at the opening of the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca, which is located between Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore, is essentially a strategic choke point. It basically connects the Indian Ocean over here with South China Sea located over here. So the Malacca Strait is the only opening which connects Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. And this further connects the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean as well. Since huge volumes of trade passes through the Strait of Malacca, it acquires a great significance for countries in the region, including India and China. So the access granted by Indonesia to the Indian Navy, wherein India can access the Sabang Port and its facilities, will be of great strategic importance for India in order to patrol the waters near the Strait of Malacca. Also, India might take part in the development of port facilities in Sabang and as well as a special economic zone in the Sabang region. So as you can see, the Sabang Port project will have both a commercial and a strategic angle to it. Considering the rising tensions in the South China Sea region, largely because of China's aggression, this outreach by India with Indonesia will be of great importance because this would provide India an opening into the Southeast Asian region. India will be able to dominate the waters near the Strait of Malacca. Apart from granting access to India with regard to the Sabang Port, both the countries have signed multiple agreements in the field of defense cooperation between the two sides. Let's have a look at them. The two leaders have signed an agreement with regard to information sharing on white shipping. White shipping is a technical word which is used to refer to a practice of sharing information between two countries with regard to commercial shipping vessels. If two countries are working together in the area of white shipping, it essentially means that they have an advanced information sharing agreement between the two. They will jointly work to build intelligence and they'll try to track the commercial vessels which are passing through their exclusive economic zones. So this would be a very important agreement because India would be able to monitor the shipping traffic near the Strait of Malacca. Then apart from that, India has sought an inclusion into the important Malacca Strait Patrol, which is basically a joint maritime security cooperation arrangement between the four Southeast Asian countries, that is Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand. These four countries, they started a joint maritime security cooperation agreement in the year 2004 and it's called as the Malacca Strait Patrol. The navies of the four countries, they take part in joint coordinated patrols in the region. They try to combat piracy, they try to deal with non-state actors, and they essentially try to maintain peace and security in the important Strait of Malacca region. So India has sought an inclusion into this program, but as of now, Indonesia has put India's proposal on hold. But apart from that, Indonesia has agreed to provide mutual logistical support for Indian naval vessels which will be visiting the region. Essentially, Indian naval ships and even submarines, they will be provided berthing facilities and as well as refueling facilities in the naval facilities of Indonesia. Indonesia has important naval bases located near the three strategic choke points in the region. One is the Malacca Strait, which we have already discussed. Next, you have the Sunda Strait, and the third one is the Lombok Strait. These are three important passageways located near Indonesia. All the three straits are very important for commercial shipping and as well as for the Chinese Navy, which ventures into the Indian Ocean region. China is known to push its naval vessels and submarines into the Indian Ocean region through these straits which are located in Indonesian waters. As you're aware, China has been trying in the last few years to enhance its presence in the Indian Ocean region. And this is something that India wants to counter, and as a result, India is trying to build strategic defense partnership arrangements with all the Indian Ocean littoral states. We have done this recently with Seychelles, wherein India has gained access to the Assumption Island. India has recently worked out a port sharing arrangement with Oman as well. We have a similar arrangement with Iran as far as the Chabahar port is concerned. So India getting access to the Sabang Port in Indonesia and also getting logistical support and refueling facilities in Indonesia will be a great step forward for the Indian Navy to establish its presence near the Strait of Malacca. And during the visit, the Indian Prime Minister has brought up a number of issues of mutual concern between India and Indonesia. This also includes China's growing aggression in the Indian Ocean region and as well as in the South China Sea region. China literally claims the entire South China Sea as a part of its exclusive economic zone. It has run into a number of maritime disputes with Vietnam, Brunei, Philippines, Malaysia, and as well as Indonesia. India, which is very much interested in a peaceful world order which provides for free and open navigation, it has expressed its concerns and it is trying to work with like-minded countries to ensure that China doesn't violate international provisions as prescribed by the UN clause or the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea. China has been acting in direct violation of the UN clause, and India has clearly condemned the display of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, because India believes in abiding by international principles and India believes in a rules-based order which will provide for the fundamental right of navigation in international waters. So this was a common topic of mutual concern which was discussed during the visit. So if you look at the arrangements which have been worked out, especially in the maritime security area, we will find that there is a lot of synchronization between India's Act East policy and as well as the SAGAR doctrine with the Global Maritime Fulcrum doctrine of Indonesia. India has converted the Look East policy into the Act East policy in order to provide greater focus on Southeast Asian countries. And we also have come up with the SAGAR doctrine, which stands for security and growth, for all in the region. Essentially, under this doctrine, India plans to establish itself as the net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. And these two policies of India, that is the Act East policy and the SAGAR doctrine, they are in synchronization with the Global Maritime Fulcrum of Indonesia. Under the Global Maritime Fulcrum doctrine, Indonesia plans to establish itself as the commercial hub in the Southeast Asian region. It wants to use its geographical location to its advantage and become the fulcrum between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So as a part of this doctrine, Indonesia has tried to build close defense and economic relations with all the major powers in the region. So this policy is very similar to India's Act East policy and as well as the SAGAR doctrine. Essentially, both the countries, they want to establish themselves as the net security providers in the region. So this provides for a lot of common ground for India and Indonesia to work together. And Indonesia being one of the powerful countries in the ASEAN group, it provides the right opening for India to further promote its Act East policy. Apart from discussions on maritime security, India and Indonesia have also discussed enhancing their economic ties and as well as their cultural ties. India has reviewed the existing free trade agreement between the two countries, and both countries are working towards increasing trade and investment between the two sides. So after his visit to Indonesia, the Prime Minister paid a brief visit to Malaysia as well. This was a brief stopover, but nevertheless a very important one. Recently, Malaysia has witnessed national elections. It is considered as a historic election because Mahathir Mohamad has won a landslide victory in the recent elections. With this, Mahathir Mohamad becomes the world's oldest elected leader, and Prime Minister Modi has become the first world leader to have personally congratulated the Malaysian Prime Minister. So apart from exchanging niceties, India has also brought up enhancing economic and cultural ties between the two countries, because Malaysia is also a part of the ASEAN group with which India has an FTA. Malaysia also acts as a very important source of investment for India. Indian investment also finds a big market in Malaysia as well. So both economic and cultural ties have been brought up, and both the sides have decided to revamp these exchanges. So going forward, there would be greater focus on trade, investment, and especially on infrastructure between India and Malaysia. After the brief visit to Malaysia, the Indian Prime Minister continued his journey towards Singapore. Singapore has clearly established itself as the global financial hub in the Southeast Asian region, and India finds Singapore as a very important trade and investment partner, and as a result, both the leaders have agreed to deepen their economic and defense relations as well. Because Singapore being a very small country, it is constrained by geography when it comes to training and deployment of its armed forces. So as a result, India and Singapore have a long-standing arrangement wherein Singapore trains its armed forces in Indian defense installations. So this intimate relationship between India and Singapore has been taken forward. Both the sides have signed an agreement on logistics cooperation between their respective navies, which again involves providing berthing and refueling facilities for each other's naval ships and submarines. Also, India and Singapore have an annual bilateral naval exercise called as SIMBEX, and this year SIMBEX would turn 25 years, and both the countries have agreed to commemorate the SIMBEX exercise and to further deepen their cooperation in the field of maritime security. So this clearly gives a strategic angle to India's relationship with Singapore. In fact, there are many parallels between India's ties between Singapore and Indonesia. Especially in the maritime security domain, we have a similar objective when it comes to our ties with Singapore and as well as Indonesia. And apart from defense relations, both India and Singapore have discussed the possibility of upgrading their relations in the economic domain, such as increasing trade and investment, also focusing on technology, especially in the field of urban planning. There are many areas of expertise where Singapore is a global leader. It includes the domain of financial services, the domain of skill development, urban planning, the implementation of smart cities, because this is a flagship program of the Indian government as well, to merge technology with urban planning and development. So Singapore being a global leader, India has a lot to learn from Singapore as well. So this calls for greater engagement in the field of artificial intelligence as well. So these were some of the important areas which were discussed, and mutual agreements have been signed in these respective domains. And finally, if you look at the cultural relations between India and Southeast Asia in general, Buddhism is one common thread between the two sides. India has been the birthplace of Buddhism, and it has gained popular appeal in almost all the Southeast Asian countries since the ancient and medieval times. there has been a clear export of ideology from India towards the Southeast Asian and East Asian cultures. So this is something that India tries to capitalize on as a part of its soft power projection. In fact, as a part of our Act East policy, India has given a great deal of importance to cultural diplomacy as well. Under this domain, India tries to capitalize on its Buddhist heritage and it tries to promote and even propagate Buddhist values in these Southeast Asian countries, because this would give India a very unique leverage when dealing with the respective governments. So as a part of these efforts, the Prime Minister gifted a replica of the Buddha Gupta stone to his counterpart in Singapore. The Prime Minister of Singapore was gifted a replica of the Buddha Gupta stone. Now let me explain the cultural significance of the Buddha Gupta stone. It is an ancient inscription in the Pallava script. It details the export of Buddhist values and Buddhist ideals from India to Southeast Asia in the ancient times. So the original replica is well preserved in India itself in a museum in Kolkata, and India has gifted a replica of this to the Singapore Prime Minister just to stress on the point that India and Southeast Asia, and India and Singapore in particular, they share a very close civilizational and cultural connect. And while the Prime Minister was in Singapore, he also participated in the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is an annual defense conference, a summit of military and security officials from across the world, which is conducted in Singapore. It's essentially a track 1 diplomatic engagement. It is held annually in Singapore and it is conducted by the International Institute of Strategic Studies. So every year, defense ministers, security officials, and even military officers from across the world, they participate in the Shangri-La Dialogue to exchange ideas and discuss priorities in the geopolitical domain. So this is a global event of great significance, and for the first time, an Indian Prime Minister was invited to address the gathering. And Prime Minister Modi has participated in the Shangri-La Dialogue and he has outlined India's approach towards the Southeast Asian region and as well as towards the Indo-Pacific region. So during his address, the Prime Minister underlined the foundational principle of India's foreign policy, which is the principle of strategic autonomy. The Prime Minister said that India tries to balance its relations with the major powers of the world. India doesn't prefer siding with one bloc against the other. India doesn't really encourage the formation of power blocks in the region. Rather, India stands by internationally accepted principles, and in the pursuit of these principles, India will establish friendly diplomatic relations with all competing powers of the world. This includes balancing India's relations with the 3 poles of the world, which is the United States, Russia, and China. In the recent past, India has been caught between the strategic rivalry between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China as well. On one side, India is building very close defense and strategic ties with the United States. This can be witnessed by the fact that India's defense engagement with the US has been increasing considerably over the years. And on the other hand, we are trying to balance our relations with Russia and China as well. Quite recently, the Indian Prime Minister has worked out informal summits with Russia and China. The Indian Prime Minister met with the Chinese Premier during an informal summit at Wuhan and had a similar engagement with the Russian President during an informal summit at Sochi. So these recent developments, they indicate that India is essentially trying to protect its national interests and it is trying to promote the principle of strategic autonomy, wherein it is guided by its independent foreign policy approach and it is not curtailed by the policy choices of other countries. India doesn't really believe in taking sides in the geopolitical domain, and India has made this point very clear at the Shangri-La Dialogue. If you look at some of the global arrangements that are there, you have a grouping or informal grouping called the Quad or the Quadrilateral, which is led by the US, Japan and Australia. Even India is a part of this grouping. You have the Malabar naval exercises, which are conducted between this set of countries. So this definitely causes a great deal of worry in Russia and China as far as India's foreign policy choices are concerned. But India tries to balance its growing closeness with the Quad countries by working out closer relations with Russia and China as well. The best example for this would be the recent informal engagement between the Indian leadership and the leadership of China and Russia, and as well as India's membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is dominated by Russia and China. Then you also have an important regional grouping, that is BRICS, where all the three countries work jointly together. So this engagement of India with global rival powers is a clear display of a balancing role that India's foreign policy is trying to work out. So this is exactly what the Prime Minister has outlined at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He has promised the global leaders that India will pursue an independent foreign policy. It will never affect a friendly nation, and it will never try to take sides in the ongoing geopolitical battles across the world. So essentially, India has outlined its support for a rules-based order in the emerging region, that is the Indo-Pacific region. Currently, the geopolitical focal point has shifted from the Atlantic Ocean towards the Indo-Pacific region. With the rise of China and with the subsequent decline of the European powers, the United States has invested greater diplomatic and military investments into the region in order to counter the rise of China. Also, the ongoing strategic rivalry between US and Russia puts the focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Along with this, when you look at the ongoing tensions in South China Sea and as well as in the Indian Ocean region, which is primarily because of Chinese aggression, it becomes very evident that India has to stride a middle path and support a rules-based order which will abide by international principles. So in pursuit of this, India has extended support to free and open navigation in the Indo-Pacific region, and this is the reason why India has prioritized maritime security cooperation and economic ties with the Southeast Asian countries. Because these Southeast Asian countries, they represent an opening for India into the Indo-Pacific region. So this is a new concept which is emerging, wherein countries like US, Japan and Australia, they are focusing on building a rules-based order for the Indo-Pacific region. And they expect India to play a very prominent role in this area. Along with this, the United States has recently renamed its Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command. This is widely believed to be a symbolic gesture towards India and a call from the United States for a greater engagement from India in the Indo-Pacific region. So considering these global developments and regional developments as well, the Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore is of great importance, and it is also a very big boost to India's Act East policy as well as the SAGAR doctrine. So in conclusion, India's embrace of the Indo-Pacific concept creates more opportunities for our Act East policy, but we need to wait and watch whether India will live up to its commitments. This is exactly what India's partners in Southeast Asia would expect from India. So with this, we can conclude the discussion. For more such free lectures on UPSC topics, kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and as well as our Facebook page. Thank you.